So here we go. Deuteronomy chapter 5. Let's stand together for the reading of the word. Deuteronomy 5, beginning at verse 7. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Father, these are your words given first to Israel, but also to us, that we might learn your will, that we might understand you, that we might understand the world we live in, both physically and spiritually. And so, Lord, I pray that you would just expand our understanding of these things that are in your word today to our hearts and to our minds. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. So there's a lot to talk about in this passage and the ones that follow. But for this passage alone, where God is demanding that his children, that he calls his inheritance, his possession, Israel, he said, I want you to worship and acknowledge me and me alone. And we need to expand our supernatural worldview a bit and understand what Moses and ultimately what God is saying when he says, you shall not worship other gods. Well, what are other gods? Because we also get, these other messages in the Bible. We get this very familiar proclamation in the following chapter, repeated several times in the Bible. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And we say, well, how can you say there's other gods? Look, this passage says our God is one. So not only is there great support for Trinitarian doctrine in this verse, because we have three mentions of God being one, Lord, God, Lord equals one. That's kind of cool. But beyond that, Israel is being told that their God is one. And the prophets often declared things like, there is none besides Yahweh. And you might think that verses like this define monotheism and they rule out the existence of other gods. So we have to ask the question, if our God is one, if there's no one but our God, are there other gods? And if so, what are they? And in the first passage of Deuteronomy 5 that we opened with, it says, you shall have no other gods before me. And we say, well, if there's no such thing as other gods, what's the point of this? This is not an admission from God that or is this not an admission from God that there are other gods? And then we get all the comparative passages. There's a whole bunch of these. The ones that communicate God's greatness. And what's he being compared to? He's being compared to other gods and his inability to even be compared to them. There's not even worthy of being compared to them. There's a whole bunch of them. Psalm 86, verse 8, there's none like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like yours. Psalm 95, verse 3, for the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. Psalm 96, verse 4, for great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. Psalm 97, 9, for you, O Lord, are most high over all the earth. You are exalted far above all gods. And who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? There's more. There's just a handful of them. So the Bible is telling us in these passages and in others that our God is in a completely different class. Our God is the only one who is eternal with no beginning and no end. Our God is far above anything else. There is no other gods that are like our God. And if we want real world examples, all we have to do is look at every civilization in history, and still amongst many modern civilizations, there's always a strong emphasis upon some form of deity. It's like, why is it that every culture, every civilization, going back as far as we know, there's always some emphasis of worship upon a deity? And I think there's two parts to that. One, it says in the Bible that we have been created with eternity in our hearts. And I think there's something within us that seeks to worship something greater than us. God wired that in us. He wants us to worship him. But that gets misplaced with a lot of people. And so people are always seeking some deity to worship. People always have and still do worship other gods, and sometimes they do it by means of images or idols. And we don't see a lot of that here, but visit India. You'll see it on every single street corner. And this doesn't mean that there's a deity behind every idol, but this is the established principle. So there are other gods. They cannot be compared categorically to Yahweh. But the question we have to ask is then, well, who or what are they? Because oftentimes we just kind of have simplistic ideas. It's like, well, they're all demons, or I don't know what they are, or they're made up things. But what does the Bible teach us about it? And why is it important? Well, he talks about them. So first off, they are spiritual in nature. They inhabit the spiritual realm. And the Old Testament uses a word to describe beings that inhabit the spiritual realm. And this is a term that basically just means this is a being that inhabits the spiritual realm. And the word that the Old Testament uses to describe a being in the spiritual realm is the word Elohim. And you're like, wait a minute, I thought that was another name for God. Well, the most common individual in the Bible for whom Elohim is interpreted over 2,000 times is, of course, Yahweh. But in every passage I just read to you where our God compares himself to other gods, the other gods are called Elohims. So in biblical terminology, they are Elohim, or the plural form Elim. And this refers mostly to our God, but it also is used of what are called the sons of God in the heavenly council. We see that sometimes in the Old Testament. It's also used of the gods of foreign nations. In 1 Samuel 28:13, they use the word Elohim for the spirits of the dead. And it's used in reference to angels. So real quickly, let's talk about where these gods came from. And we'll go into this in more depth, or simply repeat a lot of this when we get to Deuteronomy 32. But simply stated, just as God created man, God also created those that became the gods of the nations. He didn't create them with the purpose of being evil. God didn't say, I'm going to create these sons of gods of mine so that they can rebel against me and go do evil things in the world. This, of course, wasn't God's intent. He didn't create them so they could rule over those nations unjustly. But just as the men God created have the free will to rebel, we see also in the Bible that the Elohim that God created, the sons of God, that they too have the free will to rebel. In familiar terms, we like to use the term fallen angel. It's like, the rebellious angels, the fallen angels. And this terminology is a bit off. And the most general term used for them, and here's some passages, is they are called sons of God. Psalm 82, verse 1, Psalm 89, 5 through 7, Deuteronomy 32:8, Job 38, verse 7, 1 Kings 22, Job 1, 6. Who are these spiritual Elohim with God in heaven? They are the sons of God. So sons of God are the beings in heaven that we might normally call angels at time when they are assembled. They are called the divine council. And we see that also in the Old Testament. When they serve a function as messenger, they're called angels. So angel is not a heavenly being. Angel is a function that a heavenly being carries out. Angel refers to a role. It's what the Son of God is doing, not really who the Son of God is. So if you look up the word angel means messenger. So if a spiritual being, an Elohim, a son of God, comes to earth to serve in the role of messenger, then they are an angel. Just like we use terms like that, You could say, Well, Jonathan Hickory is a police officer. Yeah, but he's still also just like a normal guy, right? But when he's serving the function of that role in his uniform, we know what he is. Now, also, when these Elohims would serve in the function as adversary, when they would, for God's purposes or against God, either way, against God or for God's purposes as an adversary in the Old Testament, the Hebrew term would be, they would be called Ho-Satan, or the Satan. Every time Satan is used in the Old Testament, there's a definite article, the Satan. It's not a name. You know, some people like to put a definite article in front of their name. You know, hey, how you doing? I'm the Chad. Well, that's kind of dumb. Now, this is especially true when the rebellious Elohim we call the devil is referred to. Whenever he's called Satan, he's, in the role of adversary. So, however, did you know that the angel of the Lord was called Satan once in the Old Testament? When the angel of the Lord stood against Balaam, the whole talking donkey thing, remember that? He stood against Balaam as an adversary. And he was called Ho-Satan, thus Satan. David was even called Satan once. So Satan is a function, a role, not necessarily a name. And so because they inhabit the spiritual realm, in the most basic term, they are called Elohim. Most are good, most are serving God in obedience, some have rebelled. And we see two different rebellions of the sons of God in the Bible. We'll cover those in a moment. But real quick, here's the classification. We're working up towards what the gods are. Okay, we're laying a foundation. We got to know where they came from. Okay, so here's a little slide. God's spiritual beings in heaven, all those with them that we normally call angels, those are sons of God. Elohim, general term of any being that inhabits the spiritual realm. Angel is a son of God serving as a messenger. Thus Satan is an Elohim serving as an adversary. So there's a general breakdown. Terms we're used to. This is kind of what the Bible teaches us about those terms. And so you say, well, Chad, what about demons? There's no evidence that demons and fallen sons of God are the same thing. There's this assumption in the church, demons are fallen angels. There's no evidence for that. There's no teaching on that in the Bible. There's something completely different. And to tell you the truth, the Bible doesn't tell us what demons are. That might be kind of frustrating. I want to know what a demon is. You're going to tell us what the gods are. We can't get that answer. I can't tell you what the demons are. However, there are ancient writings, and this is what the people in Jesus' day would have believed because they read these ancient writings. They believed these things. The Jews who are committed to religious writings at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were, they believe these things. They find it written in their documents. It's in First Enoch, which was a very common document that they read religiously in that day. And so what they would have believed, based on these writings, that a demon was the disembodied spirit of the Nephilim. You're like, that sounds crazy. Well, that's what they believed. That the flood killed off the Nephilim, but the spiritual part of them survived. That's what demons are. And that's a theory. The Bible does not tell us what demons are, so we don't know what they are. We just know they're bad. So the gods of this world that cannot be compared to our God, that our God is telling his children to not worship, they started out in the heavenly sons of God category. And you might wonder, what would possess a son of God living in heaven with God, seeing God, knowing God's power, working with God in all the things that God was doing, because God liked to serve and lead in community, always will. That's why one day we will rule and reign with him. He's always done it that way. Why would these beings, knowing God's power, seeing him, being with him, what in the world would cause them to rebel? And to answer this, I often look ahead to Revelation. And I consider what happens after God rules and reigns here on the earth for 1,000 years. Imagine what that's going to be like. New heaven, new earth. God is ruling and reigning here. There are people on the earth, people who are living, people in that time period multiplying. And we will be spiritual with him, ruling and reigning with him. These are going to be people who know the existence of God. Might even be able to see it. I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's going to be obvious that God is ruling and reigning for 1,000 years. And so it says in Revelation 20, after 1,000 years of his reign on earth, that people will still, when given the opportunity to be deceived by Satan, people will still rebel. Doesn't that boggle the mind? How would people still rebel after living in a world where God is so obvious to them? It boggles the mind. People often say, if I could only see God, if I could see his miracles, if he would reveal his presence to me, that I would believe him and I would serve him. Well, maybe, but that doesn't mean that the capacity for rebellion doesn't exist. People who see and know God's presence for 1,000 years, some of those people will still rebel. And sons of God who live in God's presence in heaven, they have proven that they also can rebel. The first rebellion was in Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God came down. They took the daughters of men. They gave birth to the Nephilim. The result of that was great rebellion. It led to irreversible corruption upon the earth. And this is why the flood happened, because people became so utterly wicked. These things were connected. The second rebellion began after the division of the nations at Babel, and this is what Deuteronomy 32 briefly describes. Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. And if you read all of Deuteronomy 32, it's probably one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible. It's a song. Moses sang this. But the point of it was to show Israel how special they are to God. The whole book is. And how loved they are by God. And in contrast to this verse, he goes on to say, the Lord's portion, my portion, what I have chosen is Jacob. That will be my heritage. And Jacob's name was changed to Israel. This nation would be God's. So God is saying, I gave the administration of the nations over to my sons of God, but I, the Most High God, the creator of all things, the only one ever created, I took you, Israel, as my special nation. So now we have God saying, all of these nations here on the earth, there are going to be different sons of God ruling over them. And then God says, I'm going to choose Israel. And if this happened at Babel, Israel didn't exist. God said, well, I got a guy. He's over there in the Ur of the Chaldees. He's kind of old, but that's where I'm starting. I'm going to go find me this Abram, and I'm going to call him, and I'm going to build my nation from this one guy. So that's the point of Deuteronomy 32. Israel is my special nation. But the other nations, God let them be ruled by the sons of God. So where is the rebellion? If this is the second rebellion, where is it? Well, one, it's manifest in the demonstration of these nations, because these nations became wicked and depraved. And number two, it's manifest in God's judgment of these nations. And we find that judgment in Psalm 82, where God pronounced judgment upon them. What did these sons of God do? Here's a list. They judged unjustly. They showed partiality to the wicked. They did not give justice to the weak and the fatherless. They did not maintain the right of the afflicted or the destitute. They did not rescue the weak and the needy. They did not have knowledge. They did not have understanding. They walked in darkness. So God said, you, my spiritual being, here in heaven with me, you will rule over this nation. You'll be the spiritual, these will be your people. Go rule them in justice. And we find out that they didn't do it. So they were judged for their wickedness. That's what Psalm 82 is about. A judgment that will come to pass in the end times. They're still awaiting that judgment. So when Moses says, you shall have no other gods before me, this is who he's talking about. Now we know who those gods are. The wicked powers, the wicked rulers, the wicked territorial princes, which is what principality means, These were the gods that ruled over and had authority over the other nations. They were jealous, rebellious, wicked, self-serving. They developed ways for the people to worship them and honor them. They were not omnipresent like our God. They gave the people idols. They required horrible things out of their people. They required immoral sacrifices. They extolled in their people a freedom to walk in every human passion, be it sexual immorality or violence or murder or warfare. And the thing is, they're still out there doing their thing in this world. The only difference is that authority they once had over the nations has been revoked. The authority that they had has been broken. And through the work of Jesus, God has opened the door to all the nations, that all would be free to believe in him and be a member of his kingdom. So they were all bound under the authority of these sons of God, but now they are not anymore. The sons of God who are part of this judgment in Psalm 82, those who are in heaven with God, who are obedient, they said this prophecy after this declaration, after this judgment. They declared this prophecy at the end of Psalm 82. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit the nations. And many from those nations first came into his kingdom at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Why do you think there was a list of all these different regions and nations that these people were from? Because this was a declaration that God's kingdom, the doors to God's kingdom, now were wide open for any person from any other nation in the whole wide world, because the authority that once held them, the spiritual authority that once held them, had been broken. Paul describes the transition of power this way in Colossians 2:15. He, that is Jesus, disarmed the rulers and authorities, that's the gods, and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. And so we know, well, these gods are still there. They're still awaiting their judgment in Psalm 82. They're still causing problems. People are still worshiping them. But since the resurrection, they have been disarmed and put to shame. So now we know who the other gods are. Verse 7, now we know that they desire to be worshipped. Verse 8, we learn why a person from Israel should not bow down to one of their idols. God says, I am a jealous God. Basically, God is saying, you are my people, not theirs. You're mine. Look at all that I've done to call you unto me. Look at the great privilege that you have to have a God who judges in justice. And, I gave those nations to underlings who rebelled and ruled in wickedness. I took you as my own. I rule you justly. God is actively engaged in the establishment of his sovereignty in their lives. And idolatry would be akin to divided allegiance. If you're married, you can relate to this. God tells Israel repeatedly that when they worship the gods of the other nations, they are committing adultery. He tells them, it's like you, my bride, going to visit a prostitute. In that song in Deuteronomy 32, where God tells Israel how privileged they are to be his, he remembers their time of pride. They grew fat. They grew content. They grew strong in their own means and prideful. And what did they do? In verse 15 of Deuteronomy 32, it says, they forsook the God who made them. And here's what forsaking the God who made them looked like. Verse 16, they stirred him to jealousy with strange gods, with abominations. They provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. You were unmindful of the rock that bore you, and you forgot the God who gave you birth. We see that God's jealousy had consequences, long-term consequences. And here's the warning. If you do this, if you provoke my jealousy, if you go off and do these things that I translate as being you hate me. If you worship another God, that means you hate me. If you do this, there are long-term consequences. He says, I'm going to visit the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. And this is something that is repeated in Numbers 14, verse 18, and Exodus 20, verse 5. And a lot of people look at this and say, that sounds terrible, that God would punish children for their father's sin. That's not what's happening. Some would say this is evidence for, this is a generational curse thing, that there's no such thing as a generational curse. This is actually a demonstration of God's love and patience. What this term would have meant to the ancient hearer when he says to the third and fourth generation, it simply means, I will visit your iniquity. Like, I will know your sin, and I will come and bring consequences into your life because of your sin, as long as it takes, as long as it is required, for however many generations. I will not forget that you are my nation. And so this is a warning. Your sin of idolatry now may have long-term implications on your children. If you practice this, it's likely your children will practice this. And instead of teaching your children to worship God, you will teach your children to worship idols, and thus you pass on my visitation upon their iniquity. For God to visit the iniquity, it means this, that he will impose upon them an unpleasant, consequential condition because of their sin, so that they would look at themselves, they would look at their life, they would look at the world they live in, and they would say, this is terrible, this is awful. What have we done to bring this terrible thing upon us? Like the prodigal son that day that he just said, I would do a lot better being my father's servant. I've hit the bottom. I want to eat what the pigs are eating. This is what God is saying. I'm going to bring things into your life that make it obvious to you that you need to come back to me. Now, there are those who think that everything is a formula and like to over-spiritualize and sensationalize things in the Bible, use passages like this to define an invented doctrine. I already mentioned it. The invented doctrine is generational curses. Maybe you believe in generational curses. Well, go ahead. The Bible does not believe in them. Let me start out by saying there's nothing in the Bible, this passage included, and the repeats of it in Numbers and Exodus, there's nothing that supports the made-up doctrine of generational curses. What this passage is teaching is that if the next generation continues to walk in the guilt of their fathers, God will remember them. And in the next generation, God will remember. You will not out-generation the memory of God. He will remember who his inheritance is. Why? Because God will still know who his people are. God will continue to be jealous for his possession. God will still be available for those who might repent and return to him. It's a gracious thing that he would continue in this way. He will continue to visit them in their rebellion, generation after generation, because he wants them to open their eyes and see, we've done something wrong. We need to turn back to our God. And you actually see that happening at times in Israel's history. He doesn't forget. Now, concerning this idea of generational curses that I strongly believe doesn't exist in our Bibles, you can believe it if you want, but it's not there. It's infiltrated the traditions of the church, who are kind of drawn to more sensationalistic stuff. But let's see what the Bible does say in terms of that. Ezekiel 18:20, the soul whose sin shall die, the son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. This is how God operates. Deuteronomy 24:16, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. And you'll say, well, what about my cholesterol? I got that from my mom. What about that? That's just genetic stuff. That's just part of being a broken, imperfect human. If we look at verse 9 in context to the continuing thought in verse 10, it all makes sense. If you worship idols and your children do, and this keeps on happening, I will continue to be jealous. I will continue to want my people to come back to me. I won't let them forget my presence. I'll continue to visit their iniquity. They'll always have some kind of trouble or hardship or conflict or opposition in their life. God will visit it upon them to let them know, I still love you. I have not forgotten that you are mine. I don't want you to think that what you are doing now is okay. He's patient and long-suffering to visit his iniquity. But in the same way, to those who don't worship idols, here's the promise, Deuteronomy 5:10, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. These are your options. Worship God. Worship the gods who judge unjustly, who give preference to the wicked. Worship the gods who give justice, who don't give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Worship the gods who don't maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, who don't rescue the weak and needy. Worship the gods who don't have knowledge or understanding. Worship the gods who walk in darkness. Worship them and suffer my visitation upon you. Or keep my commandments and know my steadfast love. Well, I wonder which one I should do. I don't know about you. I would be motivated to keep his commandments. So, we've done one of the 10 commandments. Pastor Chad, this is going to take forever. Let's do one more. Deuteronomy 5:11. This is one of my favorites because it means so much to us as Christians. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And let me start out by saying, this does not mean don't use God's name as a cuss word. That's what I grew up being taught. Sure, you were growing up, you grew up being taught that. But that's not what this means. You know why you shouldn't use God's name as a cuss word? Well, duh. It's just disrespectful. He's your God. That's common sense. We don't need a verse. This is so much bigger than that. It's so much more than careless words. The word take not the Lord's name in vain. The word take means to take up or to lift up or to bear. It's something we carry. Today, moms are going to come up here and they're going to lift up, they're going to bear the weight of this potted plant, and they're going to carry it. And people will say, oh, look, you're carrying a flowered plant. I can see it on you. I can see it in your hands. I can see that somebody did something nice for you. They were thinking about you. I can see everything that's demonstrated in this, that you're a mom and somebody wanted to recognize your momship. Okay, so something is being communicated there. So what are we in terms of this commandment taking up or bearing? It says we are bearing God's name. And just as mom carrying this plant, everyone will see, oh, that means something about who you are and what someone gave to you. When we bear God's name in our life, there should be something that is seen by the world around us. We are to carry and represent his name in our life. Now, there's a theological connection between the name of God and the concept of humans being created in the image of God. The word bear his name, if we bear his name, we're representing him to the world. Same thing for his image. If we were created in which we were created, if we bear his image, we're representing him to the world. So we were created in the image of God. We all bear or carry with us the image of God. Every human does. Every human is an image bearer of God. There's not a literal connection between the word name or image, but I believe this is what it means to bear the name of God. His name, his identity, who he is. We were designed as image bearers of God to reflect and represent who he is to the world around us. We carry that. We take that up. We represent it. We are image bearers of God. All humans are. Every human is an image bearer of God no matter what they believe. And here's where the truth of this passage comes in. Israel, as God's possession, had the opportunity to bear God's name with purpose. You were designed a certain way. You are called to live a certain way. And there's a purpose in how you are to carry my name into the world. They had the opportunity to bear the image of God as those who actually knew and believed God. They had the opportunity to represent themselves to the world as ones who were living according to the design of their maker. And for them, it was just a matter of living out the commandments, of doing the things that God had called them to do, and to be distinguished from the world, to be separate from the world. So much of what we see in the Old Testament for Israel is like, you need to be distinguished. You need to be different. You are my image bearers in a world that doesn't know me. But if they worshiped idols, they'd still be bearing the image of God, right? They'd still be image bearers. But they would be doing it in vain, without purpose. They'd be reflecting God's name in that they were Israelites. They'd be reflecting God's image in those who were created in his image, but they would be doing it without the purpose of God's creation. God made us, his design, and his purpose for his design is that his will would work through the life of his design. And I think this is incredibly applicable to us. And after all of this theological stuff about sons of gods and idols, we can actually get something to apply to our lives practically and spiritually here. We as believers in Jesus, as followers of God, as members of his kingdom, we have the opportunity to bear, to carry, to reflect his name, his image to the world around us. God looks to us and says, you can actually live in this world according to the design of your making. I made you, and you can actually live according to my instruction manual. You can bear my image with purpose, because everyone else out there is bearing my image in vain. But you can bear my image with purpose. I just have a few more things to say. The band, you guys can come up here. So unbelievers are in God's image, and they're reflecting that image to the world in vain. They aren't living according to his instruction. They're like, imagine a fry cook, the guy that flips burgers, and he's not using a spatula, he's using an iPhone. He's just like, this thing doesn't work very good. But he's flipping burgers with the iPhone. And the people at Apple find out about it. And they call up and they say, that's not what we made the iPhone for. You're not supposed to flip burgers with the iPhone. It's made for something so much more than that. To stop flipping burgers with the iPhone. You are bearing the image of our iPhone in vain. Dumb illustration. I think it kind of works. Here's what this commandment means to us. It's simple. Are you a believer in Jesus? If so, stop living like people who aren't believers in Jesus. Stop living for the stuff that they're living for. Stop being motivated by the same stuff that motivates them. Stop being influenced by the stuff that influences them. If you are undistinguishable from an unbeliever in your life, in your parenting or in your work or in your language, in your activities or in your behavior, then you, Christian, in those times, you're bearing the name and the image of God in vain. God was jealous for his people. He loved them. He wanted to bless them. He wasn't going to forget them, even after several generations. He wanted them to live the best possible life they could live in his justice, in his mercy, and in his protection. And part of that was to take up his name with purpose.